Imagine an empire at its pinnacle, where the golden temples of Karnak rose toward the sky, where the Nile pulsed like a vein through the heart of the world's most enduring civilization. Egypt, in the 14th century BCE, was a kingdom of gods and mortals, of stone and sunlight, where the divine touched the earth through ritual, tradition, and an endless dance of continuity. In this world, the name Ammonius echoed louder than that of any king. His temples swallowed more wealth than any treasury, and his priests wielded power rivaling the throne. It was a world saturated in orthodoxy, until she arrived. Her name was Nefertiti, but to speak it plainly is to miss the gravity she would one day hold. For no one knew then that this beautiful stranger, possibly of foreign origin, or perhaps born from the noble bloodlines of Egypt itself, would one day stand at the center of a spiritual and political storm that would shake the very foundations of Egyptian civilization. Her past remains shrouded in mystery. Some scholars believe she was the daughter of a powerful courtier named Ai, a man destined to become Pharaoh himself. Others suggest she was a Mitanni princess, sent to Egypt to seal an alliance. Wherever she came from, she did not arrive in Thebes merely to be admired. She arrived with purpose. As the royal bride of Prince Amenhotep IV, she entered a palace already trembling beneath the weight of contradictions. Her husband was young, reclusive, and different, one whose thoughts seemed to wander beyond the mortal plane. While most heirs to the throne spent their youth in war games and statecraft, Amenhotep IV pondered the heavens, the sun, and the light that broke upon the sacred river. The moment Nefertiti joined him, something shifted. It was not merely affection that bound them, but a shared vision, a reverence for what might lie beyond the reach of Egypt's many gods. Thebes, the religious capital of Egypt, bustled with activity under the eyes of Ammonius. His priests were more than ministers, they were kingmakers, economic titans, guardians of the dogma that linked the heavens to the earth. And yet, from the shadows of the palace, Nefertiti watched her husband begin to drift away from that structure. At first, it was subtle, a mention of Aten, the sun disk, as more than just one of many gods. A quiet preference for rituals held in open courtyards where sunlight could touch the skin. She encouraged him, even as others looked on in confusion. For Nefertiti, the sun held more than warmth. It held purity. It burned away pretense, stripped the divine of all but its essence. She did not yet preach a new religion, but she had already turned her face toward the light. The royal court, ever alert to changes in tone and preference, noticed the shift. The couple commissioned temples to Aten even before Amenhotep had taken the throne. Reliefs showed the disk of the sun extending rays tipped with hands, reaching down to bless the royal pair. It was a motif never before seen in Egyptian art, an intimate portrayal of divinity as something not distant, but personal. Nefertiti, radiant and poised, was not depicted behind her husband, but beside him, sometimes even larger, more central. To the artists of the court, it was clear. She was not merely queen. She was co-creator of a new spiritual order. When Amenhotep III died, the transition of power should have followed the prescribed rituals. But nothing about the new reign was predictable. As Amenhotep IV ascended the throne, he did so with a posture of subtle defiance. He did not immediately travel to the temples of Ammonius to affirm his loyalty. Instead, he turned inward, toward Nefertiti, toward Aten, toward something the court could not yet name. Within the first year of his reign, he ordered the construction of a great temple to Aten in Thebes itself, dwarfing many of the existing sanctuaries. The priesthood of Ammonius, alarmed, could not yet intervene. After all, the young king had not abolished them. He had merely expanded his devotion. But expansion was only the beginning. Behind palace walls was eternal. She did not say it aloud, not yet. But in her chambers, in the light that fell through the latticework, she contemplated a singular truth. To change Egypt would require more than divine inspiration. It would require power, symbolism, and the steady erosion of the old world. And she would be its architect. She stood beside Amenhotep IV as he made his most dramatic break from the past. In a move that shocked the priesthood, the court, and the nobility, he changed his name. No longer Amenhotep, Ammonius is satisfied, but Akhenaten, effective for Aten. It was a renunciation as much as a declaration. In one stroke, the king publicly severed ties with the dominant god of Egypt. And in doing so, he did more than assert a new faith. He declared war on centuries of tradition. And Nefertiti stood with him, not behind, not beneath, but shoulder to shoulder. They commissioned new art, new temples, new hymns. Nefertiti became the muse of a civilization in flux. Sculptors depicted her in poses once reserved for kings, striking enemies, receiving tribute, offering sacrifices directly to the sun. Her figure was strong, regal, yet human, far from the distant, aloof queens of the past. She was real, present, powerful. In the great temple courts, she walked beside Akhenaten in ceremonial processions, her daughters in tow, her eyes lifted toward the radiant Aten. The sun was no longer an object of worship. It was an experience, a reality that bathed all in equal light. Among the people, confusion reigned. Farmers still whispered the names of Ammonius and Osiris in the dark. Soldiers prayed to Horus before battle. But the court had changed, and Egypt's heart beat differently. Nefertiti's role became more than symbolic. She hosted foreign envoys, oversaw temple administration, and, some suggest, managed state affairs while her husband grew more isolated in his spiritual pursuits. The line between queen and co-ruler blurred, then vanished. There had been powerful queens before, but none who wielded authority quite like this. In the city of Thebes, the tension became unbearable. The grandeur of Ammonius temples stood as monuments to a world Akhenaten and Nefertiti no longer acknowledged. The court could not endure the contradiction. And so, together, the royal couple made a decision no monarch had ever dared before, to abandon the sacred city, to leave behind the palaces of their ancestors, the temples of the gods, the tombs of kings, and to build something entirely new. In the barren cliffs of Middle Egypt, they found a place untouched by other gods. There, between the river and the desert, they envisioned a city devoted entirely to light. Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, would be born not from conquest, but from conviction. And Nefertiti, more than queen, more than consort, became its soul. The story of Nefertiti's rise had only just begun. The world would soon know her not merely as a beautiful stranger, but as a sovereign force. As the sun rose over Akhetaten, cast shadows long and deep, but for a time, in the city of light, Nefertiti stood at the very center of the sun. The sun rose differently in the second year of Akhenaten's reign. It did not simply crest the horizon. It surged into a sky unclouded by doubt. Within the sacred precincts of Thebes, the king who once bore the name Amenhotep no longer played the role of a cautious heir. He had shed the shadows of the past, stepped beyond the long reach of his ancestors, and emerged as something else, a sovereign redefined not by lineage but by conviction. The transformation was not sudden, but it was unmistakable. And at the center of this awakening stood Nefertiti, no longer a royal ornament, but a force of motion, a muse of revolution. Together, they began to dismantle the invisible scaffolding that had supported Egypt's religious system for over 1,000 years. It was not just temples and idols. It was the very language of kingship, the rituals of death, the architecture of belief. And as they peeled back these layers, what emerged was a new idea, raw, exposed, and blinding in its intensity. Aten, the singular god, not of darkness and rebirth like Osiris, not of war and vengeance like Set, but of light and life itself, now stood alone at the summit of the divine hierarchy. The great court of Karnak, once echoing with the chants of Ammonius priests, fell silent. Offerings once meant for the multitude of gods were redirected. Processions now bypassed the traditional shrines. The court artists, previously restrained by rigid stylistic codes, were unleashed to depict a different kind of reality. Statues no longer idealized perfection. They rendered Akhenaten and Nefertiti with elongated skulls, full lips, slender limbs, and intimate gestures. Family scenes, with children climbing onto laps and kissing their parents, replaced static hieroglyphic postures. The divine was no longer distant. It was here, among them, in the warmth of sunlight and the bond of blood. But for all the radical change, it was Nefertiti's image that captured the public's imagination. In frescoes and reliefs, she towered with regality, holding scepters, striking down enemies, offering sacrifices directly to Aten. She wore the blue crown, the kepresh, a symbol once reserved for pharaohs. It was more than representation, it was revelation. Egypt was being shown a new model, a queen not merely beside the throne, but on it. In some depictions, an unshakable purpose. Nefertiti assumed a role no queen before her had dared to claim so openly. She was no regent, no ceremonial consort. She was the embodiment of divine partnership. In one remarkable stele, she stands alone before Aten, making offerings without her husband, signifying not just trust, but authority. It was as if the royal couple had become the earthly dyad of the Aten, the sun above, and the two of them below, mirrors of its perfection, lenses through which its light entered the world. It was around this time that Akhenaten began to remove even the last vestiges of the old gods from public life. Hieroglyphs that once bore the names of deities were carved away or erased. The traditional titles of the pharaoh, which had always invoked Ma'at and other gods, were rewritten. The word God itself became synonymous with Aten, and Nefertiti's role as high priestess of this singular worship became solidified. She presided over daily rituals, held court in the open-air sanctuaries designed without roofs, where nothing came between the worshipper and the sun. With power came scrutiny. Foreign envoys arrived, bearing gifts and curiosity. What was happening in Egypt? Why had the greatest empire of the Nile turned its back on its gods? Why did the queen speak with such finality, such vision, as if her words were not suggestions, but destiny? Letters from the Amarna archives, clay tablets unearthed centuries later, hint at these tense diplomatic exchanges. And in them, Nefertiti's influence is palpable. She is not merely referenced, she is addressed, responded to, acknowledged as a political entity in her own right. And yet, behind the radiance, cracks began to form, not of belief but of burden. The court became insular, filled with converts and loyalists, but increasingly disconnected from the rhythms of the wider empire. The people, always practical, whispered prayers to Ammonius in the night while performing daylight rituals for Aten. Resistance grew, invisible but patient. But Nefertiti pressed on, aware, perhaps. She raised them as symbols of continuity. They appeared in public art, dancing before Aten, crowned with sun discs and uraeus. The family of the sun became more than image, it became ideology. Through these daughters, the new world would endure. Or so it was hoped. Inside the sacred city of Thebes, unrest fermented. The closure of temples had sent waves through the economy. The equilibrium of millennia had been broken. Nefertiti knew this. She was not blind, but she believed, fervently, that the cost of change was always steep, and that the reward of truth was worth the upheaval. So she stood, day after day, in the temples to Aten, her hands lifted in praise, her daughters arrayed behind her, the rays of the sun reaching down to touch her brow. She did not falter. She did not retreat. As Akhenaten's obsession with purity and divinity grew more intense, it was Nefertiti who stabilized the state, who managed the complex bureaucracy, who ensured the survival of the new city they were already planning. A city unlike any Egypt had seen before. A city with no temples to other gods. A city built on a virgin site, untouched by previous dynasties. A city where the horizon belonged to the sun alone. A city called Akhetaten. And so, in the closing years of Thebes, as dust settled on the shuttered sanctuaries of Ammonius, Nefertiti laid the foundation not only of stone but of ideology. Her fingerprints were on every edict, every altar, every vision. She was not just the wife of a radical pharaoh. She was the voice behind the throne, the compass in the storm, the architect of Egypt's most daring spiritual revolution. But revolutions do not rest. They do not sleep. And as Nefertiti watched the setting sun bathe the Nile in gold, she knew the time had come to move beyond Thebes, to leave behind not just a city, but a legacy, and to begin again under the open sky of a new world. The queen had awakened the king, but in doing so, she had also awakened history itself. The desert wind carried more than sand. It carried omens. Thebes, once the heartbeat of Egypt's divine rhythm, had grown silent in its sanctuaries. Ammonius' colossal statues, still towering and unmoved, stared blankly toward horizons now forsaken. The sacred priests who had once led festivals with throngs of worshippers found themselves surrounded by the echoes of emptiness. It was not merely a shift in theology. It was an occupation. And the occupying force did not arrive with chariots and spears. It arrived with sunlight and silence, with closed temples and redirected offerings, with edicts written not in blood, but in light. In the heart of this storm stood Nefertiti. By the third year of Akhenaten's reign, were masks of man's imagination, tools of control, shadows cast in flickering torchlight. But Aten was real, unrelenting, undivided, and in this divine singularity, she saw a new path for Egypt, one not fractured by competing theologies but united beneath a single perfect source. Nefertiti became more than an icon of devotion. She became its commander. While Akhenaten withdrew deeper into spiritual contemplation, composing hymns and issuing philosophical declarations, Nefertiti governed the mechanisms of erasure. Her hands touched every decree. The closures of Ammonius temples in Karnak and Luxor bore her seal. The suppression of the Memphis priesthood echoed her administrative will. She did not raise weapons, but her signature was as sharp as any blade. Her battlefields were papyrus scrolls. Her armies were scribes and architects. Her victory would be measured in silence, the silence of the old gods forgotten. But war, even ideological, demands sacrifice. The people did not rise in celebration. They rose in confusion, found themselves unemployed or compelled to relearn the stylized iconography of Aten worship. The temples of the old gods did not simply represent religion. They were the spine of an economy, and that spine was now broken. Still, Nefertiti persisted. In the capital, new iconography dominated public spaces. Carvings of Aten's rays stretched downward, ending in human hands that gently caressed the faces of the royal family. Nefertiti was always there, sometimes larger than Akhenaten, sometimes elevated higher, sometimes the sole figure beneath Aten's reach. To the common Egyptian, she became the living face of the new faith. She walked among them in processions unlike any before, open-air rituals conducted beneath the sun, music rising without drums, incense burned not for a statue but to the sky itself. Children watched in wonder. Elders watched in fear. Among the nobles, unease turned to resistance. In the provinces, governors raised quiet objections, cloaked in diplomacy. They wrote letters questioning the closures, citing regional instability, requesting compromise. Those letters were received and declined. The royal couple responded with unwavering clarity. The old gods were no longer recognized. Egypt was no longer a land of many gods, but one light. And those who could not see would be left behind. Diplomatic tensions followed. In the court records, fragments of correspondence from foreign rulers reveal confusion and frustration. Some requested traditional alliances with blessings from established gods. Instead, they received responses filled with solar theology and divine praise to a god they did not know. Nefertiti's voice, at the heart of this transformation, was not just belief, it was architecture. Nefertiti oversaw the construction of new temples dedicated solely to Aten. These temples defied every tradition. They had no inner sanctums, no veiled idols, no darkness. They were open courts exposed to the sun without roofs or shadows. They welcomed the gaze of Aten without obstruction. These were not places of mystery, but of light. And in each, her presence was immortalized. Reliefs show her leading prayers, pouring libations, anointing altars. In these images, she is more than queen. She is high priestess, divine intercessor, and sometimes indistinguishable from the pharaoh himself. But with each sun-drenched ceremony, the cracks grew wider. Rumors of famine trickled into the court. Trade routes once stabilized by shared religious customs became fragile. Internal order began to fracture. And yet, Nefertiti stood resolute. She believed, perhaps more than Akhenaten, in the righteousness of their cause. Her faith was not romantic, it was engineered. It was as disciplined as it was passionate. To turn back was to undo the light, and she would not allow darkness to return. The turning point came when the couple made their most audacious move yet, the complete abandonment of Thebes and the establishment of a new capital. Not a renovation of an existing city, not a symbolic shift, but a total departure. A city built from nothing, in the middle of the desert, with no historical claim, no sacred associations. They called it Akhetaten, the horizon of Aten. The very act was a declaration of war, against history, against memory, against everything Egypt had been. And Nefertiti was its general. She did not simply approve the plans. She orchestrated them. City grids were drawn with celestial alignment in mind. Temples, palaces, administrative buildings, all were placed to optimize the path of the sun across the sky. Workers toiled day and night, not just in service of a city, but of a vision. And at the heart of that vision stood Nefertiti, watching the sunrise, her silhouette carved into stone before the city was even complete. Those who dared speak of rebellion did so in whispers. The army, loyal to the crown, remained silent. But the priesthood, dispossessed and humiliated, did not forget. In hidden chambers of ruined temples, prayers to Ammonius continued. In distant villages, festivals for Hathor were held in secret. And among the educated elite, doubts fermented. Could one god replace all others? Could a single light fill every shadow? Nefertiti did not flinch. She doubled down. In Akhetaten, she ensured that every relief, every stele, every inscription reinforced the new order. Dissenters were dismissed, skeptics replaced. Even members of the royal family who hesitated were sidelined. This was not merely religious policy, it was identity, purpose, destiny. And it was irreversible. Yet even as her control tightened, even as her image spread across temples and scrolls, one question remained unanswered. What happens when the sun sets? The war against the gods was not a battle of a day or a year. It was a war against memory, against culture, against the very bones of Egypt. And though she had won many fronts, the cost was mounting. The old gods may have lost their temples, but they remained in the hearts of the people. And hearts, Nefertiti knew, were harder to change than stone. Still, she pressed forward. Not with arrogance, but with the quiet, relentless force of one who believes history is a malleable thing. She believed it could be rewritten, reimagined, reborn. And she was willing to bear the weight of that rebirth, no matter the price. In the third year of their revolution, Egypt was no longer Egypt. It was Aten's land, Aten's kingdom. And at the center of its radiant new empire stood a queen who had not merely survived the war against the gods. She had led it. But revolutions do not end with victory. They evolve. They test their architects. And soon, the queen who built a city of light would have to confront the one shadow even the sun could not banish: time. It rose from the sands like a vision too perfect to be real. A city not born of centuries, but of conviction. Not shaped by dynastic inheritance, but summoned into existence by the sheer force of belief. Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, was no ordinary city. It was the manifestation of an idea, the physical form of a spiritual revolution. And its architect, its soul, its radiant heart, was Nefertiti. Long before the first brick was laid, Nefertiti walked the barren cliffs between the river and the desert. She saw what others could not. A land untouched by sacred memory, unclaimed by old gods, free from the weight of Egypt's past. Here, the sun rose and fell unimpeded. Here, Aten could be praised without competition, without shadows, without echoes of Ammonius or Osiris or the thousand others that cluttered the Egyptian pantheon. Here light reigned supreme. She stood beside Akhenaten when he declared the spot sacred. Not because of an ancient tomb or a mythic event, but because of the purity of the horizon. No king before them had ever dared to found a capital in such a place. There were no temples, no roads, no infrastructure, just cliffs, sand, and the unwavering gaze of the sun. That was enough. The construction of Akhetaten was as radical as its purpose. Designed with symmetry, with openness, with celestial alignment, it defied the conventions of Egyptian city planning. Streets were wide, intentionally aligned with the sun's daily path. Temples were roofless, flooded with light. Palaces were airy, surrounded by gardens and pools that reflected the sky. Even administrative buildings bore inscriptions not of gods and conquerors, but of daily life, of family, of radiant joy. Nefertiti oversaw it all. She was no passive consort admiring progress from a shaded balcony. She walked the scaffolds, inspected the stonework, questioned the artisans. Her vision was exacting. The temples had to be perfect, not massive in the style of Karnak, but elegant, open, modern in a way that would have stunned her ancestors. Every carving of the Aten's rays had to end in delicate, human hands. Every depiction of the royal family had to emphasize closeness, warmth, affection. For in this city the divine was intimate. The gods no longer lived behind veils and thresholds. The God was here, now, among them, in every breath of sunlight. The city rose faster than any had thought possible. Caravans arrived daily, bringing stone, timber, food, and laborers. Farmers from across the Nile Valley came seeking work and found purpose. Scribes recorded every decree, every foundation, every wall. And in every inscription, the names of Akhenaten and Nefertiti were inseparable. Pharaoh and queen, priest and priestess, partners not just in governance, but in destiny. Artists, given new freedom under the Amarna aesthetic, created images never seen before in Egyptian art. Nefertiti was depicted in movement, in laughter, in tenderness. She was shown playing with her children, kissing them, holding them in her lap. She was carved smiting enemies, riding in chariots, anointing officials. The range of emotion of humanity was staggering. And through it all, Aten smiled down, arms outstretched, giving life. The royal palace was not a fortress, but a sanctuary. Open courts, shaded colonnades, fountains, and floral gardens replaced the heavy stone of Thebes. In the great temple of the Aten, Nefertiti led daily offerings, dressed in elaborate robes of white and gold, her tall blue crown gleaming in the sun. She poured wine, burned incense, and sang hymns composed not for statues, but for light. Her voice became the liturgy of a new age. But Akhetaten was more than a religious center. It was a fully functioning capital with laws, trade, schools, and international diplomacy. Nefertiti ensured that each sector operated in harmony with the new doctrine. Judges were appointed not by blood, but by merit. Taxation was restructured to prioritize temple construction and public works. The city was a model not only of belief but of order. Foreign dignitaries arrived in awe. They stepped from their ships onto avenues where sunlight seemed to dance in patterns across polished stones. They were received not by shadowed priests or stern generals, but by a queen whose poise disarmed and captivated. Nefertiti spoke to them not of war, but of peace, not of conquest, but of enlightenment. They returned to their homelands with tales of a city unlike any other, ruled by a woman whose power was as soft as it was absolute. And yet, beneath the gleam, tensions lingered. The priests of Ammonius had not disappeared. They had dispersed. They watched, they waited. Their god, though banished from the temples, lived on in whispers and in hearts. In Akhetaten, dissent was rare, but not absent. Quiet prayers to old gods found their way into the cracks of the new city. In the marketplaces, songs were sung that Nefertiti had not approved. Each was raised in the shadow of Aten. but the absence of a male heir hung over the court like a cloud. Akhenaten's health began to decline. He spent more hours in seclusion, speaking only to the sun, leaving Nefertiti to manage the daily affairs of the city. She ruled in all but name. Ministers came to her first, generals sought her counsel. Foreign envoys addressed their letters to her as often as to her husband. Her name was spoken in every chamber, every ceremony, every prayer. Some speculated she would become co-regent. Others whispered she already was. A few dared to imagine the unimaginable, that she might succeed Akhenaten as pharaoh in her own right. Egypt had never seen such a thing. But then again, Egypt had never seen Akhetaten. Anything was possible in the city of the sun. And so she reigned, not from behind the throne, but from beside it. She walked its streets with her daughters, stopping to speak to merchants, to children, to workers. She attended festivals not as an observer, but as a celebrant. She held audiences in open-air courtyards, sunlight filtering through the columns, her face always illuminated. She was everywhere. Her beauty had become legend, her wisdom doctrine. She was not merely a queen. She was Egypt's new myth. The city flourished. Its population swelled. Its temples gleamed. Its art bloomed with color and complexity. And yet, despite its brilliance, it remained fragile. Built on sand and spirit, it depended entirely on belief in Aten, in Akhenaten, in Nefertiti. Should any falter, the city would tremble. Nefertiti knew this. She worked tirelessly to sustain the vision. She expanded temple education, trained a new generation of priests and priestesses, all loyal to Aten. She commissioned hymns to be sung daily in the plazas. But a new world, and so the city shone. The rays of Aten fell on limestone walls, on bustling markets, on sacred altars. And in the center of it all stood Nefertiti, gilded, serene, eternal. The woman who turned belief into stone. The queen who gave the sun a home. A new form of royalty emerged. One not clad in war regalia or wrapped in ancient myth, but robed in familial affection and divine intimacy. At its center stood Nefertiti, not just as queen or priestess, but as matriarch of a dynasty unlike any Egypt had known. She and Akhenaten were no longer simply rulers. They were the human embodiment of Aten's love. Gone were the depictions of lone pharaohs triumphant in battle, replaced by scenes of domestic tenderness. Nefertiti seated with her daughters, embracing them, kissing them. Akhenaten holding the hand of a child while the sun's rays reached down with delicate hands to touch the family's faces. In these intimate carvings, divinity was made visible not through power, but through presence. To be near the royal family was to be near Aten. This iconography was not accidental. It was carefully crafted by Nefertiti, who understood the language of symbols more fluently than most generals understood maps. She shaped a narrative that cast the royal bloodline as sacred, not by lineage alone but by proximity to the divine light. Their children were not merely princesses. They were daughters of the sun. They were Aten's blessings made flesh. The queen had given birth to 6 daughters, Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesempeten, Neferneferuiten Tasheret, Neferneferur, and Setapenra. Each was bestowed with titles that linked them directly to Aten, and each played a role in the public rituals of the city. Dressed in luminous linen, crowned with lotus-shaped headdresses or small solar discs, they moved in procession alongside their mother, learning the posture, the gestures, the rhythm of ceremonial devotion. Nefertiti, always precise, ensured that each movement reinforced the sacred harmony of the royal family. The people watched with reverence, confusion, and at times unease. In a land long ruled by gods who warred, died, and were reborn, this new theology offered no such cycle. There was only the sun, unchanging, all-seeing, and the family through whom its love poured, and more public rituals that drew the population into shared devotion. Her strength in mourning became a symbol in itself, that even queens must weep, but never falter. Still, some whispered that he was no longer interested in ruling the kingdom, only in pleasing Aten. Others believed he was ill, though no diagnosis would ever be recorded. In his absence, the Amarna letters, clay tablets preserved in the city's archives, show urgent requests from vassal states begging for military assistance against invaders. Many went unanswered. Egypt's presence abroad waned. Border territories destabilized. And though Nefertiti read these messages and likely understood the danger, her focus remained inward, attended by her surviving daughters, still leading the people in prayers, still believed by many to be the living conduit of the sun. Then came whispers of a boy. Akhenaten, a child from a lesser-known consort of Akhenaten, began to appear in court records. His presence signaled both promise and danger. On one hand, he could be shaped, trained in the ways of Atenism, molded as the heir Nefertiti and Akhenaten had never produced together. On the other, he could become a tool for those who sought to restore the old ways. The queen, pragmatic and perceptive, moved swiftly to secure influence over his upbringing. Some sources suggest that she betrothed him to her daughter, Akhetaten, a political move as much as a maternal one. But time was no longer her ally. Akhenaten's health deteriorated further. He appeared rarely in public, and when he did, he seemed frail, distracted, almost spectral. His speeches lost their clarity. His proclamations grew erratic. The weight of divine vision had become a burden, and Nefertiti, now in her mid-30s, found herself not only as mother, high priestess, and administrator, but as the only pillar still holding the city together. And yet, she did not break. She reorganized the bureaucracy. She elevated loyal officials. She presided over legal reforms that protected workers and artisans. She ensured grain stores were replenished, even as drought conditions in parts of Upper Egypt threatened famine. She expanded educational centers in the temples to train young scribes in the Atenist doctrine. Her rule was no longer symbolic, it was absolute. And still, she smiled beneath the sun, as if the warmth of Aten was enough to shield her from the grief that never truly left her. In the city of Akhetaten, the people still gathered daily to witness her processions. They still sang the hymns she had commissioned. They still offered thanks for the light. But in their hearts, they had begun to feel something they dared not name. Not doubt, but distance. The divine family, once so close, so real, now seemed unreachable. The city still gleamed, but its foundation no longer felt eternal. Nefertiti must have sensed it, but she did not allow it to slow her. She believed in legacy, in momentum, in the idea that what they had built could outlive its founders. Her daughters, her rituals, her city, these were the vessels through which her revolution would continue. She did not fear death. She feared erasure, and so she carved her image deeper into stone, repeated her name in every temple, left her presence in every plaza. If the gods of old had endured through monuments, so too would she. But dynasties are not sustained by monuments alone. They require succession. They require unity. And as the end of Akhenaten's reign drew near, Nefertiti faced the greatest challenge of all. Not enemies, not heretics, but the question of what would remain when she and her king were gone. For now the sun still shone. The family of Aten still walked among the living. And Nefertiti, mother of princesses, queen of a new world, stood beneath its rays with unshaken grace. But the warmth was fading, and far beyond the sandstone gates of Akhetaten, the old gods stirred in silence. For a time, the sun had seemed enough. Its rays fell equally upon prince and pauper, priest and peasant. In Akhetaten, the very light of day was doctrine, and belief was etched into stone rather than whispered in the dark. Nefertiti had ruled not merely through decrees, but through presence, visible, radiant, untouchable. But no light is without shadow, and in the 6th year of the Atenist revolution, the shadows began to lengthen. At first, it was subtle. A missed ritual here, a late shipment of grain there. A priest caught reciting an old hymn not sanctioned by the new order. A scribe omitting the sun disk from his scrolls. Nefertiti had long known that the revolution was not complete. It was a constant act, a daily reaffirmation. She had built Akhetaten not just to glorify Aten, but to distance the court from the rot of the old cities, the old gods, the old priests. Yet rot, like doubt, spreads in silence. Outside the city's boundaries, Egypt still existed. Crops still needed sowing. Nubian gold still needed transporting. The delta still seethed with ambition. Governors in distant provinces had grown restless, watching their autonomy shrink under the queen's centralized vision. They saw her religious zeal not as enlightenment, but as tyranny. Reports came of local officials refusing to dismantle temples to Ammonius, of military outposts that invoked the name of Horus before battle, and worse, of statues to Akhenaten and Nefertiti being defaced in secret. The queen's agents were swift, glimpsed only in processions where his frail frame was all but held upright by attendants. The king who once composed hymns and walked barefoot in the temples now barely spoke. Some believed he had gone mad, others that he had already died and was being impersonated. In truth, he was slipping into a realm beyond statecraft, beyond even faith, a realm where Aten alone held sway. And so, the vacuum widened. Nefertiti stepped forward, as she always had. Her appearances grew more frequent, her decrees more direct. She revised city policies to combat rising food shortages, initiated trade negotiations with eastern neighbors, and oversaw temple operations personally. Her daughters, now older, assisted in ceremonial roles. Akhetaten, especially, was presented more often as heir presumptive, her name increasingly tied to royal duty rather than just ritual. But outside the court, the city's harmony frayed. Artisans went unpaid as tax revenues shrank. Farmers complained of new levies to support temple construction. Soldiers grumbled about disorganization and supply delays. And at the edges of Akhetaten, shrines began to appear small, crude, and illegal. They bore not the sun disk, but the familiar forms of Anubis, Isis, Thoth. The old gods, exiled from state temples, had not died. They had simply gone underground. Nefertiti ordered the shrines destroyed, but new ones always appeared. She increased public ceremonies, flooding the city with festivals and music, trying to reignite the joy of belief. For a time it worked. The crowds returned. The songs were sung, but their voices lacked the fervor they once had. Devotion had cooled into duty, and duty, when forced, turns bitter. Then came a blow from within. One of her highest-ranking advisors, a man raised in the temples of Aten and loyal for over a decade, was caught colluding with dissenters in Memphis. The charges were irrefutable. He had smuggled scrolls bearing anti-Atenist propaganda, funded renovations of an Ammonius shrine, and encouraged local officials to declare autonomy from the capital. Nefertiti ordered his arrest and public trial, not merely as punishment but as warning. Yet the trial backfired. The accused spoke eloquently, not in defense of his actions, but in criticism of hers. Before a stunned courtroom, he questioned the wisdom of discarding Egypt's heritage, the cruelty of erasing gods worshipped for millennia, the suffering caused by a faith imposed rather than embraced. His words struck like lightning. The room did not erupt, but it shifted. The silence afterward spoke louder than protest. Nefertiti remained composed. She sentenced him to exile rather than execution, a calculated gesture of mercy. But she knew, as did everyone, that the trial had exposed a fracture that could no longer be plastered over with gold and sunlight. Behind palace doors, she considered her options. Her daughters were loyal but untested. Akhenaten was increasingly absent. And the boy Akhetaten, though young, was becoming a figure of interest. Courtiers once fearful of her now hedged their allegiances. Old families, whose power had been shattered by the Atenist reforms, sensed opportunity. She tightened her circle. Those who questioned her were dismissed or reassigned. Loyalists were promoted, sometimes beyond their experience. The bureaucracy bent to her will, but began to creak under the pressure. Mistakes multiplied. Projects stalled. Letters went unanswered. And still, she smiled in public, cloaked in linen, radiant beneath Aten's gaze. To show weakness was to invite collapse. But alone, in the high windows of her palace, she watched the city differently now. The same avenues, the same temples, the same gardens. Yet something had changed. She saw in them the weight of effort, not the joy of creation. Akhetaten, once a dream made real, now bore the marks of survival. His people had once walked with heads lifted to the sun. Now they looked sideways, uncertain. Even the art had begun to change. Reliefs grew less fluid, more rigid. The joy once carved into limestone now looked forced. In the tombs of court officials, the images of the royal family were smaller, less central, and in some cases missing altogether. She commissioned new works, grander, more colorful, more insistent. She had her own image carved anew, larger than before, crowned with double uraeus, draped in symbols of divine authority. In some, she stood alone beneath Aten, no longer beside Akhenaten, but centered. It was a message. To the people, to the court, to history, there would be no turning back. Then came word from the Delta. Riots in Bubastis, desecration of Atenist altars, grain warehouses looted, a temple to Batet reopened under protection from local guards. Nefertiti sent emissaries, not armies. They offered food, tax relief, a promise of peace, quieted the unrest, but did not erase the message. The revolution had stalled. Its queen remained defiant, luminous, commanding. But around her, the world was slipping back into the familiar chaos of belief, of memory, of gods with many faces. The future she had envisioned was no longer inevitable. It was contested, and yet, she did not retreat. She began to draft new edicts. Some would later interpret them as preparation for co-regency. Others would claim she was already acting as Pharaoh in all but name. In a few rare inscriptions, a new title appeared beside hers. Nefertiti, beautiful are the beauties of Aten. It may have been a ceremonial name. It may have been a throne name. History offers no certainty, only speculation. But what is clear is this. The queen who had once inspired a city into existence now fought to preserve it with every ounce of strength she had left. She held back the tide not with armies, but with will, not with fear, but with fire. In the heart of Akhetaten, she stood each morning on the palace steps, arms lifted to the sky, reciting the hymns of her youth. And the sun rose. It always rose. But even Nefertiti knew it would not rise forever. The shadows had grown long, and the light, though still bright, no longer blinded. The desert was quiet, but within its stillness, a tremor was growing. Akhetaten, the city that had once sung with praise and shimmered with conviction, now braced itself beneath a silence that felt less sacred and more uncertain. The light of Aten still poured down, unchallenged and pure, but the man who once stood as its chosen herald had receded into the shadows of his own creation. Akhenaten, pharaoh, prophet, architect of revolution, was vanishing, and in his place, only one figure remained fully visible, unwavering, immovable. Nefertiti. She had long been more than a queen. For years she had governed in his stead, presided over rituals, negotiated with foreign envoys, issued decrees, led processions, and symbolized divine favor. But now the balance had tipped beyond symbolism. Akhenaten's presence had become spectral. He appeared only when required, and even then, seemed more apparition than man. His eyes distant, his words slurred into the ethereal. Some said he had transcended politics for pure communion with Aten. Others whispered of illness, or madness, or even death covered up by ceremony. Whatever the truth, the machinery of Egypt could not function on mystery. It needed a hand on the wheel. And Nefertiti did not hesitate. Her first moves were not declarations but substitutions. Documents once signed in Akhenaten's name began to bear hers as well. Audiences once led by the king were quietly conducted by the queen. Temple construction continued under her directives. The iconography began to shift subtly at first. Reliefs that once showed her beside the king began to show her alone. offering, judging, ruling. Artists had always exaggerated divine authority, but now they were carving something bolder, a sovereign who required no consort. She took on a new name, Nefertiti, long associated with Aten devotion, but now deployed as a title of power. Inscriptions began to refer to her not simply as great royal wife or mistress of two lands, but with the full titulary of pharaonic rule. Some depictions showed her wearing the kepresh, the blue war crown or the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. She was no longer standing next to the throne. She was sitting on it. Historians would later debate whether she ruled as a regent, a co-pharaoh, or an outright successor. But for the people of Akhetaten, the distinction was irrelevant. Power flowed from her voice, her pen, her image. She was the lawgiver, the mother of the nation, the sun's chosen vessel. Where Akhenaten had once evoked awe, she now inspired confidence. And in an empire growing weary of abstraction, confidence was a precious thing. But rule is not merely presence. It is pressure. And the moment she crossed the threshold into full sovereignty, Nefertiti faced a torrent of reckoning. The borders of the empire were unraveling. Egypt's vassal states in Canaan and Syria were under attack. Messages from foreign rulers piled up unanswered. Internal rebellions flared along trade routes and in provinces whose allegiance had long depended on personal relationships with the pharaoh. That pharaoh was now absent. In his place, a woman, unprecedented, unexpected, held court. Nefertiti responded with decisiveness. She ordered reinforcements to the border garrisons, recalled aging generals loyal to the Atenist vision, and reopened communications with threatened allies. She sent emissaries not with gold or armies, but with letters of assurance, reaffirming Egypt's strength and commitment to stability. It was diplomacy under strain, and it bought time. But time was growing short. Within the capital, her transition to power was not uncontested. Factions that had once operated in quiet deference now saw opportunity. Court officials whose families had lost influence under Akhenaten began to position themselves behind Tutankhaten, the boy prince with a legitimate blood claim and a name that, though devoted to Aten, could easily be changed. Priests of the old gods, though still in exile, stirred networks of sympathizers among the populace and the artisan class. They spoke of famine, of misfortune, of daughters dead and crops failing. They whispered that the gods had not left Egypt, but had been driven out. Nefertiti knew the cost of hesitation. She reasserted the rituals. She increased food distributions from royal granaries. She commissioned reliefs depicting herself as warrior and priest, mother and sovereign. She made herself visible every day, her face radiant in the sun, her voice unwavering. And for a while, it worked. The city calmed. The temples echoed once more with hymns. The bureaucracy resumed its rhythm. But she had no time for grief and no margin for error. Akhenaten's condition deteriorated rapidly. His final public appearance, recorded in a temple relief now lost to erosion, showed a gaunt figure barely able to stand, leaning on a staff, eyes sunken. Nefertiti stood beside him, tall and firm, her daughters behind her, the line of continuity unmistakable. Shortly thereafter, the king disappeared from records entirely. His death, when it came, was not announced with the customary fanfare. No pyramids rose. No great tombs were opened. His body, if ever buried, left no lasting trace. Some believe he was laid to rest in a hastily prepared tomb in Akhetaten. Others claim his remains were secretly moved to Thebes. The truth is lost, deliberately obscured by time and politics. What remains is this: Egypt did not mourn as it once had for kings. The city did not descend into chaos, continued to function, because Nefertiti was still there. Whether she officially ascended the throne in her own name remains debated. But in effect, she was pharaoh. She led the court. She held the priesthood. She directed foreign and domestic policy. The Aten still shone. The temples still opened. The city still moved. And Nefertiti, now more myth than mortal, stood at the heart of it all. But the crown, even when earned, is never light. Her rule was burdened by contradiction. The vision she had helped bring into being was now threatened by its own success. Atenism had centralized power, but it had also alienated millions. Akhetaten had become a sanctuary, but it had disconnected Egypt's elite from its sacred geography. The queen had become a symbol, but symbols are brittle when belief begins to erode. And belief was eroding. Outside the city, unrest grew. Armed skirmishes flared along the borders. In Upper Egypt, cults of Ammonius began to reassemble, quietly at first, then with growing confidence. In the Delta, temples once abandoned reopened with local support. The edifice of Atenism, for all its grandeur, had never fully replaced what it sought to erase. The people had bowed, but not converted. They had sung but not believed. Within the palace, intrigue intensified. Some courtiers began to speak openly of Tutankhaten as heir, framing him as a bridge between factions. Others proposed a co-regency with a male protector, hinting at military restoration. Nefertiti faced all of it with cold resolve. She knew what they wanted: her abdication, her retreat, her silence. But she would not be erased. She doubled down on ritual, on propaganda, on imagery. She had monuments carved that named her as ruler. She had hymns composed that praised her alone. She had her daughters installed in high offices. She commissioned elaborate ceremonies to reaffirm her legitimacy. She became not just the steward of Aten's light, but its sole interpreter. And then, as quickly as she had risen, she disappeared. There are no clear records of her death. No tomb inscriptions. No sarcophagus bearing her name. One day she was present, ruling, radiant, revered. The next she was gone. Some say she died of illness. Others claim she was forced into retirement, or even murdered in a palace coup. Still others believe she lived on in disguise, perhaps even ruling under another name. What is known is this: her name was stricken from monuments, her images defaced, her titles reassigned. The city she built began to empty. The boy king Tutankhaten ascended. His name changed to Tutankhamen. The old gods returned. The temples reopened. Akhetaten was abandoned. And Nefertiti, queen, pharaoh, visionary, was erased from the script of official history. But stone remembers. In fragments scattered across ruins and tombs, her story endures. A face carved with unmatched grace. A title half-chiseled into a broken lintel. A statue headless but unmistakable in form. The memory of a woman who ruled when no one believed she could. Who dared to change not only Egypt, but the nature of the divine itself. Nefertiti may have vanished from her own time, but she was never truly gone. In every sunbeam that touches stone, in every face that turns upward in wonder, her legacy lives. She was queen, she was pharaoh, and for a moment in time she held the sun. It began quietly, like the shifting of sand before a desert storm. In the final days of Akhetaten, the city that had once reflected the divine purity of the sun had begun to dim, but not with faith. They endured. The sun still rose, but no one looked up. And in the hollow echo of this magnificent silence, a child was crowned. He was called Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, malleable, a blank canvas upon which the future could be redrawn. Behind him, shadows moved. High officials, many of whom had quietly chafed under Nefertiti's rule, now stepped forward. The seasoned courtier and possible grandfather of the boy became his advisor. Horemheb, a military man of ambition and command, resumed contact with the army, long sidelined during the religious revolution. The machinery of Egypt, silent and confused for years, began to stir. Its gears were greased not by sunlight but by memory, of temples, of gods, of power shared with the divine pantheon. Aten had been pure, but too distant. The old gods were flawed, but they were present. The people remembered their names, and that memory was political currency. The first change was his name. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamen, living image of Ammonius. It was more than a renaming. It was a resurrection. The god who had been banished, his temple sealed, his priests scattered, was brought back to the center of Egypt's spiritual and political life. In Thebes, the great sanctuaries reopened. Offerings returned. The hymns of old echoed once more across the Nile. And with every verse, a line was drawn through the past. The boy king made no protest. He obeyed. He signed decrees prepared for him, nodded at rituals reintroduced by his council, and sat solemnly at ceremonies crafted to evoke the grandeur of forgotten centuries. He was no tyrant. He was a symbol, a bridge, a boy whose name, though now linked to Ammonius, still bore within it the ghost of Aten. That contradiction would define his short life. One of the first acts of the new administration was to abandon Akhetaten. The city that had once symbolized divine clarity was deemed unclean, heretical, dangerous. It was emptied of its courts, stripped of its significance, left to bake in the sun that once sanctified it. The statues of Nefertiti were torn from their pedestals, her name scratched from walls, or leveled. The new state religion reinstated a pantheon crowded with faces and stories, resurrecting the world the royal family of the sun had tried so desperately to erase. But the erasure was not complete. The artists trained during the Amarna period had learned to see the world differently. They had carved intimacy, emotion, and realism into stone. That vision could not be unlearned. Even as new reliefs of Tutankhamun and the gods of Thebes were chiseled across temple walls, the human tenderness of the Amarna style lingered in the curvature of a face, the play of light across alabaster. Nefertiti's image, though defaced, lived on in fragments. She had been too present, too commanding to be fully forgotten. Tutankhamun, for his part, seemed content with his role. He married Akhetaten, daughter of Nefertiti, who now took the name Akhetaten. Together they represented the fusion of two worlds, the past and the future, the sun and the gods, the revolution and the restoration. They ruled from Thebes, but always under the close supervision of elders. Their marriage, though politically powerful, was touched by tragedy. Their children, if any were born, did not survive. Their union, meant to birth a new dynasty, would leave no heirs. For Egypt, however, the boy king's reign was a breath of relief. Foreign alliances were rekindled. Temples flourished. Festivals returned. The economy stabilized. The scars of Atenism, though deep, began to heal. And in this fragile moment of balance, Nefertiti's legacy became more dangerous than ever. Because she was not merely a queen. She had been a ruler. A woman who had spoken with the voice of Pharaoh, who had presided over ceremonies without a king, who had envisioned a world with one God and one light. Her presence in the memory of the people was not only an echo, it was a threat. The campaign to destroy her legacy intensified. Artists were ordered to chisel away her likeness. Temple priests were told to remove her name from inscriptions. Documents that once bore her signature were rewritten. And where removal proved too difficult, her identity was reassigned to Kia, to Meritaten, to nameless female royal companions. The queen who had stood tallest was made to vanish. But vanishing is not forgetting. In hidden tombs, her image survived. In damaged reliefs, her silhouette remained. Her statues, buried beneath rubble, retained their elegance. And in the minds of those who had walked with her, served her, or simply watched her from the crowds of Akhetaten, a memory lived. A woman of beauty, yes, but more of authority, of intelligence, of conviction. She had ruled, and Egypt had not crumbled. Tutankhamun's reign, though stabilizing, was brief. By the age of 19, he was dead. His tomb, discovered millennia later, would astonish the world. But in his own time, his death reignited the crisis of succession. I seized the throne, perhaps briefly marrying Akhetaten. He was old, pragmatic, and uninterested in grand visions. Horemheb followed, a general with little patience for theological innovation. Under his rule, the Amarna period was officially erased. Kings' lists omitted Akhenaten, Smenkhare, and Nefertiti. The entire era was labeled a heresy. Akhetaten fell to ruin. Its temples cracked under the weight of time. Sand swallowed its roads. The desert reclaimed the horizon. But history is not so easily commanded. In the centuries that followed, the name Nefertiti disappeared from official texts, but not from the land. Travelers found statues half-buried in forgotten chambers. Tomb robbers unearthed fragments of her image. And slowly, over the course of generations, a whisper began to grow. A legend of a queen who had ruled alone, who had stood beside the sun, who had challenged the gods and dared to shape the world in her own image. It would take thousands of years before her name would rise again, before archaeologists, brushing away the dust of millennia, would rediscover her face, perfect, serene, powerful, before scholars would debate her reign, her theology, her disappearance, before the world would look into her eyes and see not just beauty, but authority. Tutankhamun's tomb would give Egypt its most famous treasure. But Nefertiti's legacy would give it a question that still burns. How do we remember those who were meant to be forgotten? She was the queen of the sun, the ruler of light, the mother of a new world. For all her power, for all her presence, for all the sunlight that once illuminated her path, Nefertiti did not pass into legend with trumpets or tombs. She did not leave behind pyramids bearing her name, nor sprawling temples carved with her deeds. Instead, she disappeared quietly, systematically, deliberately, not by accident, not by natural decay, but by design. Egypt's memory had chosen to forget her, and it nearly succeeded. After the death of Tutankhamun and the brief, aging reigns of Ai and Horemheb, the priests of Ammonius returned to full control. The old order, once banished, now reinstated itself with vengeance masked as restoration. The dynasties that followed understood power not only as something to wield, but as something to curate, to cleanse, to rewrite. The past became a tool. The story of Egypt, as etched in stone and ink, would no longer reflect history. It would reflect obedience. In this new canon, there was no room for the woman who had challenged the gods. Nefertiti's name was chiseled off monuments. Her face was scratched from reliefs. Her inscriptions were buried under new ones. In the royal lists of kings that chronicled centuries of Egyptian rule, her reign was omitted entirely. Akhenaten's name became an abomination, his memory labeled heresy. Their city, Akhetaten, was left to rot, and every trace of their revolution was condemned to oblivion. This was not a passive forgetting. It was calculated annihilation, and it worked. For over 3,000 years, Nefertiti's story remained fragmented, a puzzle without a picture. No confirmed tomb, no royal mummy, no definitive proclamation of death or burial. What remained were scattered clues, each whispering a different version of the woman who had once ruled in sunlight. In the temples of Karnak, layers of plaster hid her titles. In the crumbling ruins of Akhetaten, her likeness appeared alongside that of Akhenaten, sometimes indistinguishable, sometimes larger, sometimes alone, but never named. In reliefs deep within unfinished tombs, a female figure appeared offering to Aten, not as queen, but as sovereign. Yet no inscription survived to affirm who she was. Scribes ordered to erase had done their work well, and yet the silence itself was telling. For a woman to be so thoroughly erased, she must have mattered. She must have wielded real power. She must have ruled. Even centuries later, when Egypt's glories were dimmed beneath the sands and the empire broken into memory, echoes of her still pulsed beneath the surface. Travelers spoke of a mysterious queen whose city had been swallowed by time. Scholars noted anomalies in royal succession, gaps in the official narratives, inconsistencies in artwork. But it wasn't until the 19th century, when modern archaeology awoke from its own slumber, that the world began to see her again. In 1912, in a crumbled studio in what had once been Akhetaten, German archaeologists unearthed a limestone bust. It had been abandoned in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose, left untouched for millennia. And when it emerged into light once more, it stunned the world. She stared back from the past, regal and serene, with almond eyes and high cheekbones, her long neck poised, her lips curved in knowing silence. her crown, the blue flat-topped headdress, unmistakably hers. She was not a relic. She was not a myth. She was real, perfectly preserved, instantly eternal. The bust of Nefertiti became one of the most iconic faces in human history. But even as her image captivated modern eyes, her identity remained elusive. Who was she truly? The beautiful consort of a radical king? A mother? A co-regent? A pharaoh? Or something even more radical? A woman who stepped beyond all roles and shaped a nation through sheer conviction? The scholars argued. They still do. Some believed she had died during Akhenaten's reign, buried in an undiscovered tomb. Others proposed that she had ruled alone under the name Nefertiti, adopting the full regalia of kingship. A few went further, suggesting she had even survived into the reign of Tutankhamun, guiding him behind the scenes, pulling the strings of state like a hidden architect. But no theory has ever been confirmed. The tombs have not spoken. The mummies, if found, remain nameless. Her story, like her revolution, remains suspended between brilliance and mystery, and perhaps that is her greatest legacy. While the names of kings rise and fall in predictable succession, Nefertiti's name resists categorization. She is both there and not, remembered and forgotten, visible and erased. Her memory lives not in long chronicles but in short interruptions, in the symmetry of a broken statue, in the missing name on a list, in the awkward chisel marks where her titles were once carved. She is history's negative space, the outline left behind when something powerful is forcibly removed. But that outline is enough. In the fragments, we see a woman who dared to change the world not through war, but through belief, who reimagined divinity not as violence but as light, who stood beside a man obsessed with the sun and became its equal, who may have ruled not just as queen but as pharaoh, who vanished but refused to disappear. The silent erasure of Nefertiti was never total. It was never final, because to erase a woman like her, the world would have had to forget the shape of light itself, and that, even the sands of Egypt could not do. For over 3,000 years, she had been a whisper in the ruins, a name half-remembered, a figure glimpsed in shadow, traced in stone, but never confirmed. Nefertiti, once the living face of a revolution, the queen who ruled beside the sun, had been carefully erased, purposefully forgotten. Her temples were broken, her name defaced, her deeds buried beneath the weight of official memory. But erasure is not the same as absence, and the past, no matter how deeply hidden, has a way of reaching forward. In 1912, that reach became tangible. Inside the ruins of Akhetaten, in a crumbling workshop once belonging to the royal sculptor Thutmose, a team of German archaeologists unearthed a bust unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. Limestone and plaster, nearly intact. She gazed ahead with eyes wide and unpainted, her skin tinted with soft hues of rose and bronze, her lips parted in an eternal silence, her crown unmistakable. The tall, flat-topped blue crown of Nefertiti. It was not just a statue. It was a resurrection. Suddenly, the forgotten queen had a face. Not an idealized abstraction, not a crumbling fragment, but a vivid, undeniable presence. And in that moment, history bent. The world looked into her eyes, not the world of ancient Egypt, but of the 20th century. And the effect was seismic. Here was a woman who had ruled as more than a wife, who had stood beside a revolutionary pharaoh, who may have ruled as pharaoh herself. And now, re-emerging into the modern imagination, she embodied more than beauty. She represented power, mystery, and defiance, a presence too strong to remain buried. The bust was transported to Berlin, where it would become one of the most visited and controversial artifacts in the world. Millions would stand before her transfixed. Artists, feminists, historians, and leaders would all claim her. She was ancient and modern, remote and intimate. She radiated calm, and yet provoked inquiry. She was timeless, yet even as the world embraced her face, her story remained fractured. Where was her tomb? Where was her body? What had become of her after the fall of Akhetaten? Scholars began to dig not only in desert sands, but through archives, inscriptions, and unexamined corners of known tombs. Theories multiplied. Some proposed that she had changed her name and ruled as Nefertiti, briefly serving as co-regent or even full pharaoh after Akhenaten's death. Others argued that she had died earlier, perhaps during a palace upheaval, and had been buried hastily, her remains now lost to time. A few believed that her mummy had already been discovered, among unidentified royal women in the Valley of the Kings, awaiting a definitive test, a match, a name. In 2015, hopes surged again. A British Egyptologist claimed that behind a wall in Tutankhamun's tomb lay a hidden chamber, possibly her burial chamber. Radar scans seemed to confirm anomalies. The world held its breath, but nothing came. The wall remained sealed. The chamber, if it existed at all, kept its secrets. And still her story spread. Nefertiti became more than a historical figure. She became a cultural symbol, a muse for designers and poets, a face reproduced on everything from museum banners to social campaigns. She inspired novels, films, operas. For women around the world, she embodied the tension between visibility and erasure, between power and silence. Her story was a mirror, one that reflected not only the past, but the struggles of the present. In classrooms and lectures, her life was no longer just a footnote to Akhenaten's theology. It was a case study in how history is shaped by politics, by memory, by those who write and those who erase. Nefertiti's rise and fall were no longer only Egyptian tales. They were human ones. She became a reminder that authority does not always survive in statues, that brilliance is often buried by the fear it provokes, that those who seek to change the world must sometimes vanish from it, only to return when the world is ready. And the world was ready. Museums debated repatriation. Should the bust remain in Berlin or be returned to Egypt? The discussions were not just about ownership, but about legacy. Who had the right to hold her image? Who could speak for her, now that she had returned? These questions, unresolved, only added to her aura. Because Nefertiti was no longer a possession. She had become a presence. Back in Egypt, her legacy continued to evolve. In 2022, when the Grand Egyptian Museum neared completion near the pyramids of Giza, hopes were raised once again that her remains might be identified, her burial place found, her name fully restored. But the sands kept their silence. Perhaps that, too, is fitting. Perhaps Nefertiti's power does not lie in closure, but in provocation. Oversaw a regime that suppressed traditional faiths and used iconography as a political weapon. But she was real. She was bold. She refused to stay within the lines history had drawn for queens. And for that, she was nearly lost to time. But not completely. She lives in the fragments, in the missing names, in the erased cartouches, in the absence that demands to be filled, in the face that refuses to be ignored, in the thousands who still come each year to stand before her, silent and stunned, as if before something divine. Nefertiti was never just a queen. She was an idea, and ideas once born are hard to kill. The world had tried to forget her, and the world failed. She came from a time buried deeper than most civilizations can remember. Her world was one of stone and sun, of empire and eternity, where names were etched into granite and legacies sculpted to outlast death. In that world, Nefertiti did not just exist, she blazed. And yet, for over 3,000 years, her name fell into silence. Not by chance, but by force. Her story was erased, her titles dismantled, her image shattered. And still she returned. The legacy of Nefertiti is not housed in a single monument, not sealed within a tomb, not confined to a golden mask or jeweled relic. Her legacy exists in the very idea that something so meticulously hidden could resurface, not despite history's attempt to forget her, but because of it. For in the absence she left behind, she created space for questions. Questions that continue to haunt historians, artists, leaders, and dreamers. Who was she, really? The easy answer, the queen, the wife of Akhenaten, the mother of princesses, is no longer sufficient. Her influence far surpassed that of any royal consort of her age. She did not merely stand beside power. She embodied it. She was the sculptor of a religion, the architect of a city, the director of a nation's aesthetic, the potential bearer of a crown that had, until then, been the domain of men. And when her world collapsed, when the empire turned its face from the sun she once worshipped, she did not shatter. She dissolved into the silence, knowing that the light would one day return. And it has. In the 21st century, Nefertiti's legacy glows not from the inside of tombs, but from the pages of books, the screens of classrooms, the halls of museums, the minds of women and men who refuse to be defined by the limits others place on them. She represents not only beauty, but the dangerous kind, beauty with voice, with vision, with intention. The kind that cannot be comfortably dismissed. She is a symbol, not of perfection, but of transformation. A woman who dared to reimagine the divine, who believed in light as law, who saw herself as part of that light, and was not afraid to shine. Her legacy is not that she won. It is that she tried radically, intelligently, without apology. In a time when conformity was survival, she chose audacity. And for that, history tried to bury her. But legacy, like sunlight, seeps through cracks. It reflects off broken surfaces. It illuminates even as it fades. Nefertiti's story survived in the slivers, on the edges of shattered reliefs, in the outlines of erased inscriptions, in the uncanny likenesses found in statues too refined to belong to anyone else. Even her name, Nefertiti, beauty of the beauties of Aten, carried a kind of encoded resilience, a reminder that radiance outlives those who try to suppress it. And so she rises again, not as a figure in someone else's history, but as a force in her own right. In academic circles, she challenges traditional chronologies. In museums, she commands reverence. In culture, she becomes a shorthand for elegance, grace, and formidable agency. In the hearts of those who feel unseen, she becomes a testament to the truth that absence is not insignificance. Perhaps that is why she endures so powerfully in the modern world. We live in a time where memory itself is contested, where history can be rewritten, where narratives are curated, where entire lives can be erased by omission. In this landscape, Nefertiti is not simply a historical curiosity. She is a reckoning, a confrontation with what it means to be remembered, and what it means to be worth remembering. The city she built, Akhetaten, lies in ruin. Its grand avenues are dust. Its temples fractured. The ideology she helped forge, Atenism, is long vanished. But none of that matters now, because ruins do not signify failure. They signify presence. They signify that someone was once here, bold enough to build, brave enough to believe. That is Nefertiti's final triumph. Not survival, but return. Not dominance, but resonance. She does not need a throne. She does not need a crown. She is remembered in light, refracted, scattered, persistent. And perhaps that is how it should be. Because the gods may come and go, and kingdoms may rise and fall, but the light remains. And in it we still see her, Nefertiti, the queen who dared to rewrite the gods.